Hi, I'm Mia Whittemore, and in this lesson we're going to be talking about the tools that I use for floral illustration. So for floral illustration, there's many different things that you can use. These are the ones that I've tried out and I find are really helpful in my practice. So one of the really important tools for floral illustration is your paint. So there's all different kinds of paints that you could use. I tend to go more for watercolor, acrylic gouache, and just regular water-based gouache. So for watercolor, you can use it right out of a tube. You can kind of squirt a little bit onto your palette and you can use it while it's wet. Or I prefer to put my watercolor paint out of the tube and into these little pans and then let it dry. So what happens is once they're dry, you can then reactivate the paint with water. So watercolor is really great because it's transparent, so you can have lots of different layers and you can do a lot of nice color blending and mixing. So with watercolor, gouache works really nicely. So gouache is essentially concentrated watercolor. So it's more opaque and it can feel a little bit more like the traditional kind of like thicker paint. But you can also water it down with water. So the first kind of gouache that I sometimes use is water-based gouache. So that means that I could put it into my palette. I could use some water to sort of get the paint as thin or as thick as I want it to be, and then I use it on my paper. If it dries on my palette, that's fine. I can actually reactivate it with water because it's water-based. So the other kind of gouache that I love to use, this is a bit newer for me, a newer material, is acrylic gouache. So acrylic gouache is the same opacity as the water-based gouache, but when it dries, it's permanent. So you can't reactivate it on your paper. So it's nice if you're working and you want to have layers that you know aren't going to blend or aren't going to move once they're dry. The water-based gouache, if you put it on the paper and it dries, you can still reactivate it with water on the paper, which can be good, but also if you don't want to have those under layers reactivating, you would then want to use acrylic gouache. So along with paint comes the paint palette. So I already showed this, but this is my watercolor palette. So it's a little tin, it's a travel tin, and it folds up and it has all these little areas where you can mix color. And it is great for travel because, like I said, it does fold up and it's really portable. And I like to keep a little chart of the different colors that are in my palette that I made myself just so I kind of have some reference for what they look like when they're dry. So aside from a watercolor palette, you might find that you like painting watercolor or gouache in a ceramic palette. So I really love painting on ceramic when I'm at home. It's nice and sturdy so it doesn't move around too much, but it's great for mixing paint on. And then also we have, this is what I use for my acrylic gouache. It's called a Stay Wet palette. So it has a lid so you can open it up. And then inside there's a paper. And then underneath that paper, if I can get it, here we go, there's a sponge that you wet and it keeps the paint wet and workable for a long time. As long as you keep the cover on, you keep re-rubbing the sponge. So it's really nice because a lot of times an acrylic gouache will dry super quick. So this keeps it workable for a long time and you don't feel like you're wasting paint. And the last kind of palette I want to show you is a paper palette. So this is a great option for gouache. And it's really quick. You don't have to worry about making like a big mess on it. You can just work on the palette and then you can throw it away when you're done. So we have the paint, we have the palettes, and from there we also have some brushes. So I use brushes in a variety of sizes. This big guy is my big wash brush. So what I'll do with this one is on my watercolor paper, usually a lot of times I'll lay down a layer of water first, or I'll lay down a color first. So I use this big brush for that. But for most of my painting, I use a variety of brush sizes but they generally tend to be in the round shape. So you can choose what kind of brush hairs you want, and that's a sort of personal preference. I like to have I like to use synthetic brush hairs, but you might find that you like natural ones yourself. You can just sort of feel the brushes, try out some different ones and see what you like. But I have a very small one right here. It's a 3/0, so that's a very small brush. A lot of times I paint with a size 4. This is an 8. So there's a variety of sizes. You just find what you like. So for paper, there's a couple things. So I, of course, always like to keep a sketchbook around me. It's a great way to gather inspiration, put your ideas down, and have it in just a book form that you can go and look back on. So of course, all different kinds of sketchbooks. So you can find one that suits your needs, that works for you. I have this Moleskine sketchbook that I like. It has some nice smooth paper, so it's good for painting and marker. So for watercolor paper, which is generally what I use to paint on, there's 2 main types. So there's hot press paper, which is very smooth, and then there's cold press paper, which has a bit more of a texture. So I personally love hot press paper, and I just like the smooth quality of it. I find it works really well with gouache, acrylic gouache, watercolor, but you might find that you like the absorbency of a cold press paper, so it's good to try out some different ones and see what feels good to you. So this is a hot press watercolor paper block. So what that means is on all sides, it's actually glued. So you'll make your painting on the top sheet that's inside, and then when you're done, you actually take just a little palette knife or any little tool, and you go and you detach all around the edges the paper, and then it's really nice because you were able to work on a nice stretched surface. You didn't have to tape down your paper or anything, and it just makes it easier. It cuts out that step of having to tape off your paper. But speaking of tape, I do like to keep artist tape around. I find it's a little bit gentler than masking tape. And I do use this when I am painting just on a regular piece of paper. I will tape it down to a board. You can tape it down to your table. Okay. So the 2 options are usually you tape down a piece of paper, or you can get a block which has the sides all attached, so you can work on top of it and you just detach it when you're done. So aside from that, I also have a trusty little paint cup. So this one's really nice because it collapses. So it's really good for travel. And I have this little paint puck inside. So this is actually a little brush cleaner that I put at the bottom. So when I'm working, I can take my brush down there and run it along the little brush cleaner, and it gets the paint out of the brush, so it keeps it the brush healthier for longer, I find. And the last couple of things that I have are my trusty my trusty pencil and eraser. So a kneaded eraser is pretty much a must, I think, for artists. It's really good because you can mold it into different shapes for erasing all different kinds of little marks. And it's also just kind of fun just to move it around. But also, I have, lastly, a pencil. So I like to draw my final sketches on my final pieces of paper using this F pencil. But you can also use an HB pencil that's kind of a standard, or you might find you want to go a little bit lighter, a little bit darker. So you can test out some different pencils and see what works for you. But I find that this one that's labeled with F works really well for me. And it's really easy to erase if I don't like what I drew. So hopefully this gives you just some jumping off point for some different materials that you might want to use in your floral illustrations. And I hope that you're inspired to try some of these things out.